It was past midnight when Rick Barnes, a Milwaukee police officer, received a call that would change his life. At 6 o'clock, he had started his shift, which wouldn't end until the sun rose. Rick was used to night shifts in the police force, always busy and unpredictable, and he had answered all sorts of calls. But nothing compared to the one he had just received. When the phone rang, Rick answered and immediately heard a sentence that disarmed him. "Please help me." It was a weak, childish voice. Rick couldn't tell how old the person was on the other end, so he followed protocol and asked, "Good evening, sir. How can I help you?" "I'm hungry, really hungry," the voice said again. Rick wasn't sure how he could help. It wasn't uncommon for people to call emergency services for things that weren't the police's responsibility. Still, he tried to be understanding. "You called the police. You'll need to contact social services in the morning when they open, okay? But, I'm hungry," the little voice repeated. At that point, Rick began to suspect that it might really be a child. He asked who was speaking, and the person said his name was Johnny. "Johnny, are you alone?" Rick asked. "Yes. My mom left, and I haven't eaten in 3 days," the child replied. Rick's heart raced. "I don't know where my mom went. She left water in the fridge, but it's gone now. I drink from the tap to try to stop the hunger, but I can't take it anymore," Johnny continued. Rick felt a tightness in his chest. He knew this wasn't technically the police's responsibility, but the local authorities who could help the boy wouldn't be available at that time. What should he do? Determined to act, Rick kept talking to Johnny while he thought about how to locate him. He asked for the address, but the boy didn't know the street or neighborhood name. So, he began to describe where he lived. "There are trees. None of those tall things, like buildings. Just normal houses." This didn't help the officer much, but he pressed on, asking if Johnny had anyone's phone number saved on the device. "No," Johnny replied. The boy then revealed that he had found some coins where he lived, which is why he was calling from a payphone, not from his trailer. This information was useful to Rick because he knew where the areas with trailers were located in the city. Rick took a chance and asked, "From your trailer, can you hear dogs barking during the day?" "Yes, I hear them. There are a lot of them." "Do you think the dogs there are hungry too?" the boy said, once again breaking the officer's heart. This was the key piece of information for Rick. He knew that one of the trailer areas was very close to a kennel on the outskirts of the city. "Will you help me?" the fragile, childlike voice asked. The officer asked Johnny to go back to his trailer and wait for the police. "Hang in there, okay? We'll be there soon to see you," Rick said, trying to mask the worry in his voice. "But what if you don't come?" "I don't know when my mom will come back," the boy replied, uncertain. Rick was trying to find an available patrol car to go to the neighborhood, but 2 weren't responding, and 3 others were busy dealing with calls that night. Determined, he stood up and told the other officers in the central station to take over his post. He knew this could get him in trouble with the captain, but he couldn't wait. He was going to go there himself and bring something for the boy to eat before it was too late. Before leaving, he asked Nate Long, another officer, to accompany him. They hadn't had their late-night snacks yet, so Rick grabbed the sandwiches his wife had made, as well as Nate's, and put them in the car. This would be the boy's first meal in 3 days. "Look, Rick, I hope this isn't a prank, all right?" Nate complained, annoyed about missing his meal. After 20 minutes, Rick and Nate's patrol car arrived at Johnny's neighborhood. They knocked on the trailer door and announced that it was the police. No one answered. Nate knocked harder, and they both heard dogs barking from inside. Worried, Rick decided not to rely on just his authority. "Johnny, are you there? It's Rick. You called me tonight." A few seconds later, they heard a groan coming from inside the trailer, like an animal suffering, unable to express what it felt. The tension grew. Rick and Nate decided to break down the door. When they entered, they saw the boy lying on the cold floor, holding his stomach. Rick approached and touched the boy, who groaned again. His voice was barely a whisper, almost fading away. Rick was already taking the sandwiches out of the package to give to the boy when Nate called his attention. Further into the trailer, in another room, they could see a leg stretched out on a bed. Johnny wasn't alone after all. In the bedroom, They saw it was a woman. She appeared to be in a deep sleep. Nate tried to call her and gently shook her through the blankets, but she didn't wake up. "Johnny, who is this woman? Is she your mom? You said you didn't know when she would come back," Rick asked while handing the sandwich to the boy. Johnny then explained, "It's my mom. But she's been like this for a long time. I don't know when she'll wake up. Sometimes she takes medicine and takes a long time to come back, you know," the boy said, his mouth full, as he devoured the sandwich. Nate asked her name and found out it was Marta. He called her name louder each time, but got no response. He pulled the blanket off her and touched her. The woman's skin was cold, like a lizard's. After seeing the condition of the child, weak and suffering alone, a chill ran up Nate's spine, making the hairs on his arms stand up. He was already preparing for the worst. He decided to check Marta's pulse. Nate looked at Rick and, trying not to alarm Johnny, announced, "She's alive, but her pulse is weak. She needs medical attention immediately." While Rick took care of Johnny, Nate went out the door to call an ambulance. Wanting to distract the boy, Rick began asking questions. "How long have you been living here? And what happened to make you run out of food?" Johnny, between bites, replied, "It all started about 10 days ago, when my mom came home from work early. She was very tired." Marta worked at a clothing factory in the stock department. Every day, she organized thousands of boxes with orders for stores and brands, moving them from one place to another. It wasn't easy work, but she faced the challenge to support her son. Marta had been a single mother since Jack, her husband, passed away from an aneurysm. With not enough income to pay the rent for the house they lived in a suburban area of the city, she had no choice but to rent a trailer in a neighborhood near the kennel. Marta and Johnny had never been wealthy, but they had some comfort when Jack was still alive. The change was sudden and painful. In the blink of an eye, Johnny lost his old friends, the clothes he used to wear, and even food began to run out. Still, the boy understood that his mother was fighting, being strong to provide the basics, a roof and some food. The factory work always left Marta exhausted. That's when she started taking some medicine to help her relax. As far as Johnny knew, his mother never consulted a doctor before starting to take them. She also didn't buy them from pharmacies. He remembered once when a colleague at the factory handed her a bottle of pills. Sometimes, Marta would sleep for a long time, which worried Johnny. But until then, she always woke up. Everything got worse 2 months ago, when the factory owners decided to install new machinery to automate the stock organization. What Marta used to do in an hour, checking spreadsheets and talking to colleagues, the machine could do in 15 minutes or less. That's when Johnny started to notice that his mother came home not just physically tired, but nervous and anxious. "Ah, son, what will become of us, huh?" she would say to him. But Johnny didn't understand what his mother meant. It was during this time that Marta began taking more medicine and taking longer and longer to come back. Then, 10 days ago, the factory owners fired Marta. The automated system had made her job, and the jobs of others, obsolete. Marta had feared this might happen, but she still hoped to be transferred to another area of the factory. But that didn't happen. In the last 2 years, she hadn't been able to save anything. Her low salary barely covered expenses for the trailer rent, food, clothes, and other basic needs. Without a job, Marta lost all ability to sustain the household. She tried to hang on as best as she could. She even tried to ask the store manager for credit to get food, but he refused. Desperate, she cried every day. She thought about going out onto the street with Johnny to ask for help, but she gave up. She didn't want to expose her son to that humiliation. At this point in the story, Johnny had finished the sandwich Rick had given him. But instead of seeming happier, the boy started to cry. The ending of the story was even sadder. Johnny explained that, in the last few days, he and his mother had run completely out of food. Marta had started taking more medicine, perhaps in an attempt to forget the hunger, while he grew weaker and hungrier. His mother, on the other hand, slept deeply, never waking up. Johnny stopped telling his story when 2 paramedics entered through the door, accompanied by Nate. That's when the boy realized something more serious was happening. His mother wasn't just asleep. He began crying harder as he saw the men place her on the stretcher and carry her to the ambulance. Rick Barnes picked Johnny up and said, in a calm and hopeful voice, "It's going to be okay, little guy. We'll go to the hospital together, okay?" Johnny went in the patrol car with Rick. Marta was admitted to the emergency room in urgent condition, while Johnny was examined by an on-call doctor. Both were diagnosed with malnutrition and dehydration. The child received N4 and regained some strength, but Marta's condition was more complicated. The medicine she had taken worsened her problems, and she needed to be hospitalized for a few days. Upon hearing this, Johnny became anxious and scared. "But what will happen to me now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Rick hugged the boy and tried to reassure him. "It's going to be okay, Johnny. There are social workers here at the hospital. They'll take care of you, but in a different place, just until your mom gets better." When Rick stood up to leave, Johnny clung tightly to his waist. "I don't want to stay here, Officer Rick. They're going to take me to an orphanage. My mom won't ever find me. Please, don't let them do that." That desperate plea hit Rick hard. He knew he had left his post to respond to this call and had spent the entire night away. It was certain he would be reprimanded by the captain. But how could he ignore this boy, who clearly needed help? Rick thought for a moment. He couldn't just leave him there, scared and alone. Then, he made an unexpected decision. "Look, Johnny, you're coming with me, okay? Just for a few days, until everything gets sorted out." He knew his wife would be surprised, maybe even shocked, by the arrival of the boy, but since they didn't have any children, maybe they could accommodate him temporarily. Rick just hoped that this small act of kindness could bring a little relief to the child. Rick talked to the hospital social workers and signed the necessary papers to temporarily take care of Johnny. When he came back, he took the boy's hand and said, "You'll stay with me until your mom gets better, okay?" The boy smiled and held the policeman's hand firmly. Before they went home, Rick stopped at a diner so they could eat something warm. While watching Johnny devour his meal with such enthusiasm, Rick couldn't help but reflect on his own life. He wondered why he had never had children. Maybe it was the fear of parenthood, but in that moment, he realized that if that was the case, there was no reason to fear it. Maybe he really could be a good father. Johnny ate a full meal, with proteins, fiber, and carbohydrates, and before they left, Rick ordered some fresh juice to make sure the boy stayed hydrated. Now, with more energy, Johnny chatted excitedly. "I miss my dad and the life we had, but I try to be a good son so my mom doesn't have one more worry," the boy said, with a maturity that moved Rick. Johnny explained that he used to go to school every day, but since they ran out of food, he had to stop. On the way to Rick's house, the boy said, "I'm happier now because my mom is being taken care of at the hospital. I'm glad you came to help us." Johnny's words deeply touched Rick's heart. Over the course of his career, he had received thanks before, but this one felt special. When they arrived at Rick's house, his wife, Sonia, was already waiting for them with new clothes and a bed ready in the guest room. The next morning, Johnny woke up and went to the kitchen, where he found Rick and Sonia preparing breakfast. He was surprised to see the table full. "It's been over a year since I've seen something like this." "Thank you, Officer Rick," the boy said, a bit embarrassed. "You don't have to call me officer, okay? You can call me Rick." "Your family now," he replied, as he served a pancake to Johnny. Later, Sonia took the boy to school, and at the end of the day, Rick went to pick him up. On the way back, they stopped at the hospital to visit Marta. When they entered the room, they were surprised to find the woman awake. Johnny ran to the bed and hugged her tightly, calling her name, emotional. "Mom." Marta smiled, her eyes filled with tears as she gently stroked her son's face. Rick watched the scene, feeling a deep satisfaction for having made the right decision that night. Marta cried tears of joy at seeing her son well fed. Although she still looked weak and pale, her appearance had already improved compared to the previous day. "Mom, this is Rick. He's a policeman. He's the one who saved us," Johnny said, full of enthusiasm. Rick stepped forward, introduced himself, and greeted her. He noticed that this time her skin had a normal temperature, very different from the morbid impression he had of her when she was unconscious in the trailer. Marta smiled at the policeman, but soon her eyes filled with tears. She began to sob and poured out everything she had been through, feeling guilty and regretful. "I didn't know what to do. I was desperate, almost gave up on everything," she said, emotional. "But now I look at this young man and thank God I'm alive, and thank you for coming to help us. I can't give up." Rick, in a reassuring tone, replied, "Johnny will stay with me as long as necessary, until you fully recover. Now, your only job is to rest and follow the doctor's instructions. By the way, you raised a very smart and responsible boy." The following days passed in a routine full of hope. Sonia took Johnny to school in the morning, and Rick picked him up in the afternoon so they could visit Marta at the hospital. The police captain even considered giving Rick a warning for spending so much time away from the station, but upon learning about Rick's dedication to saving Marta and Johnny's lives, he changed his mind. On the contrary, Rick became admired by his colleagues, who were proud to have him in the department. 2 weeks later, Marta was discharged from the hospital. Rick made a point of taking mother and son back to the trailer. As she settled back into her home, the policeman, though happy to have helped the family, realized he would miss Johnny's presence. He then made a promise. "This isn't goodbye. We'll keep visiting each other." And he kept his promise. Rick and Sonia visited Marta and Johnny several times in the following months. It was actually Sonia's suggestion that led Marta to get a new job as a secretary, in a much less stressful environment and with a much better salary than at the factory. In no time, Marta had regained her zest for life, leaving behind the medication and insecurity. Now, mother and son were living with dignity once again. 6 months after that emergency call, Rick and Sonia received spectacular news. They were expecting a child. Upon hearing the news, the policeman embraced his wife and cried tears of happiness. He thought of Johnny and silently thanked the boy. He knew that if it weren't for that encounter, he might never have had the courage to embrace fatherhood. It was as if everything was mysteriously connected. Answering that emergency call had changed his life forever, and Rick knew that his mission now was to be the best father in the world. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. And check out another emotional video that's appearing on the screen now. Enjoy and see you in the next video.